Thanks for coming, and special thanks to Professor Cantor for flying down from Virginia. My talk today is about Romeo and Juliet, but I want to begin today by observing that Shakespeare's contemporary, the poet and playwright John Marston, had little patience for love. In The Scourge of Villainy, his exhaustive satire of Elizabethan life, Marston reserves a special venom for Shakespeare's already popular tragedy. Luscus, what's played today, Marston muses with disdain. Faith, now I know. I set thy lips abroach, from whence doth flow, naught but pure Juliet and Romeo. Say, who acts best, Drusus or Roscio? Faith, now I have him, that ne'er of aught did speak, but when of plays or players he did treat. He hath made a commonplace book out of plays, and speaks in print, at least whate'er he says, is warranted by curtain plaudites. If you heard him courting Lesbia's eyes, say, courteous sir, speaks he not movingly from out some new pathetic tragedy? He writes, he rails, he jests, he courts, what not, and all from out his huge, long scraped stock of well-penned plays. In this acid moment, Marston is mocking a young fictional gallant for cribbing language from Shakespeare's tragedy in order to woo his beloved. It's a scene that might seem odd to us today, for who would dare use Shakespeare's celebrated language for anything other than a performance? But it recurs with remarkable frequency throughout the poems and the plays of Shakespeare's moment. The comedy Blurt Master Constable, for instance, features one lovelorn character proudly proclaiming to another, bid him, whose heart no sorrow feels, tickle the rushes with his wanton heels. I have too much lead at mine. It's a direct echo of Romeo's protestation just before the Capulets' ball to let wantons, light of heart, tickle the senseless rushes with their heels. Blurt Master Constable was published in 1601, just a few years after Romeo and Juliet, but echoes and parodies of the play continued in the decades to come. Shackerley Marmion's comedy The Antiquary was published in 1634, and in it, the beloved Lucretia appears at her bedroom window only for the besotted gallant Aurelio looking up at her from below to ask, what more than earthly light breaks through that window? It's a self-conscious throwback to that eminently memeable moment when Romeo beholds Juliet soliloquizing from her window and proclaims, what light through yonder window breaks. The echoes only continue from there, but they're not exactly celebratory. Where Juliet worries that Romeo may prove false, since at lovers' perjuries they say Jove laughs, Lucretia tells her suitor that wanton love laughs at your perjuries. And where Romeo wishes he were the glove upon Juliet's hand that I might touch that cheek, Aurelio desires to be a veil upon that face to hide it from the world. We find another version of this parody in The School of Compliment, a comedy of manners written by the Caroline playwright James Shirley and published in 1631. In it, a crew of hapless young gallants attend the school of the comedy's title in order to learn the language of love. Because those who can't do teach, their professor knows nothing of this subject, which is why he instructs his students to repeat to their mistresses the following line, oh, that I were a flea upon thy lip, there would I suck forever and not skip. It's a comically club-footed pickup, made all the more bumbling by its imperfect imitation of that famous moment when Romeo breaks into the Capulet garden, beholds Juliet pining from the safety of her window, and declares to himself, oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. The writers I've cited here, Marston, Marmion, and Shirley, might all seem to be taking a jab at Shakespeare's bad romance, which, as my students will tell you, is never far from the mawkish, the overdone, or the embarrassingly cliched. But it's the argument of my talk today that Shirley is asking us to laugh at something else, something that was quite common in the 16th and 17th centuries. He's satirizing the practice of quoting the plays by Shakespeare and his contemporaries for the purposes of talking love. Far from self-contained fictions cordoned off from their social milieus, Romeo and Juliet operated for its audiences and its readers as a very special kind of conversation manual. Like Shirley's hapless teacher, I want to propose, the tragedy offered playgoers and readers valuable instruction in talking love. Let's begin in 1593. This is the year that Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare's first and outrageously successful poem, was published. and it's a year when love was not just an emotion, but a fashionable style of talk. This fashion was inaugurated by the many sonnet sequences that were printed in the wake of Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, which had been published in 1591. But it was inaugurated just as much by the place where those sonnets were sold, St. Paul's Churchyard. More than just a place for selling books, St. Paul's Churchyard was also one of London's many newly and thoroughly public venues. Like the coffee shops that would soon dominate England 100 years later, St. Paul's Churchyard provided a venue in which individuals could converge as strangers and, in Gary Taylor's words, act out socially scripted, interactive rituals of self-fashioning. The many sonnet sequences that were sold in St. Paul's Churchyard should prompt us to take Taylor's use of the word script literally. As Marston would complain in another one of his satires, vain gentlemen through Paul's doth walk, delivering fine set speeches and sonneting, even though they are the brokers of another man's wit. Not just books to be read, the sonnet sequences that were sold in St. Paul's Churchyard provided their readers with scripts for presenting themselves in public and, like Marston's Luscus, wooing their beloveds. Central to this public presentation was the sonnet's characteristic style, which used antitheses, oxymorons, hyperboles, and Petrarchan conceits to express private emotional longing. By reciting such private language in public, the young men who strutted through St. Paul's Walk transformed the passions of the sonnet into a distinctive conversational aesthetic. Venus and Adonis both appeals to and consolidates this fashion for love talk. Like the sonnets of its day, the poem was sold in St. Paul's Churchyard. And what I have here is a little close-up of the bottom of Venus and Adonis, sold in St. Paul's Churchyard. And what I have surrounding it are several title pages of other printed sonnet sequences that were sold in and around St. Paul's Churchyard. Like those sonnets, Venus and Adonis was quickly used for public purposes. In The Fair Maid of the Exchange, for instance, a comedy written by Shakespeare's contemporary, Thomas Heywood, the young gallant Bowdler quotes Shakespeare's poem in another thoroughly public location, the Royal Exchange, in order to woo a woman named Moll Berry. Fondling, I say, he declares, since I have hemmed thee here within the circuit of this ivory pale, I will be a park, and thou shalt be my dear. This couplet comes straight from the mouth of Venus, and in citing it, Heywood's comedy underscores the way Venus and Adonis held for its readers a power that was akin to the sonnet. Through its lines, readers could signal their mastery of the fashion for love talk that had taken London by storm. But if Venus and Adonis resembled sonnets in its themes and its public use, its popularity exceeded that of any sonnet by far. Where Astrophil and Stella was reprinted twice, Venus and Adonis, by contrast, was reprinted 10 times during Shakespeare's lifetime, and 5 more before 1640. This remarkable popularity, I want to suggest, had everything to do with the poem's style. Like the sonnets that preceded it, Venus and Adonis uses an abundance of oxymorons and antitheses in order to express private, amorous emotions. But Venus and Adonis interestingly uses those antitheses with such rigor as to make nearly every one of its lines as portable as possible. Love is a spirit, all compact of fire, Venus urges Adonis at one point, not gross to sink, but light, and will aspire. At another, she implores, "O learn to love, the lesson is but plain, and once made perfect, never lost again." And she will similarly remind him that seeds spring from seeds, and beauty breedeth beauty. Thou wast begot, to get it is thy duty. In all of these examples, Venus draws together like and unlike entities into the same impassioned couplet. And what I have here is, I've highlighted in various different colors, various different equals and opposites, correspondences and antitheses, in order to underscore the sheer, the proliferation of figures of balance that characterize Venus's language. In all these examples, Venus draws together like and unlike entities into the same impassioned couplet. But for all of their passion, these couplets are also completely depersonalized. Venus speaks not exactly of her own experiences of love, but of love in general. In fact, she rarely speaks of herself at all, scrupulously avoiding the first-person pronoun, keeping fast to a timeless and placeless present tense, and rarely making mention of her particular addressee. The result is to make Venus's language maximally transmissible. Hers is a language that anyone can use in any conversation. In this respect, Venus makes herself into a veritable font of what early modern readers called aphorisms or sententiae. Focusing upon timeless and universal truths, aphorisms and sententiae were highly prized in the Renaissance for their capacity to signal learning and wisdom. Short, punchy, and eloquent, they tended to suppress the first-person perspective in favor of universal pronouncements. This combination of brevity and impersonality made sententiae and aphorisms uniquely well-suited for talk. Their treatment of timeless truths rather than time-bound particulars meant that anyone could utter them in any conceivable situation. And their compact and bounded structure made them distinctly amenable to the give and take of conversational exchange. Rarely longer than a sentence, aphorisms can be easily woven into dialogue, not just as statements, but as brief, eloquent replies. Replies to what someone else has said, and replies that themselves invite subsequent replies in turn. It is this amenability to conversation that separates the language of Venus and Adonis from the language of the sonnets that came before it. As a 14-line rollout of excruciating hyperboles and Petrarchan conceits, the sonnet does not exactly facilitate conversation. Recited aloud, the form turns dialogue into monologue, exchange into spectacle. But as it channels the tropes of the sonnet into the uniquely portable structure of the aphorism, Venus and Adonis converts Petrarchism into a distinctly conversational style. And it turns the budding art of conversation, itself of abiding interest to Renaissance writers, into a distinctly erotic practice. Indeed, the insistent eroticism of Venus and Adonis separates it from earlier aphorisms and sententiae. Graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower where the pleasant fountains lie. Like Venus's earlier sententiae, these lines are marked by a familiar balance of likeness and antithesis. But in making sententiae out of the erotic, the poem turns conversation into just the amorous activity that word's etymology connotes. The Latin verb, conversare, means to keep company, and as the word makes its way into English, it will acquire a notion of intimacy that Venus, in seducing Adonis, lays bare. The insistently conversational nature of Shakespeare's love poem is reflected in England's Parnassus, a printed commonplace book that was published a few years after Venus and Adonis, right at the turn of the 16th century into the 17th. Printed commonplace books might seem strange curiosities to us today, but they were immensely popular in early modern England, and their purpose was to improve the language of the readers who consulted them. This is how they worked. They exerted a range of pithy, eloquent, often sententious passages from other texts, organizing them under subject headings like faith, or justice, or love, so that readers would not have to search out such passages for themselves. Originally, printed commonplace books in England only drew upon Latin authors like Virgil and Ovid. But at the end of the 16th century, as several scholars have noted, there was a decisive transformation in this practice. Editors and anthologists began assembling printed commonplace books like England's Parnassus that featured vernacular English authors instead of venerable classical ones. Many of the key players of England's literary renaissance are excerpted in England's Parnassus. Edmund Spenser, Philip Sidney, Thomas Kidd, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe are all there. In fact, although Shakespeare is prominently excerpted, he's not even the most highly cited author in the anthology. That honor goes to Spenser, who's cited nearly 300 times. But it's significant that among Shakespeare's works, Venus and Adonis is excerpted 26 times. To put this number into some context, Love's Labour's Lost, Richard II, Richard III, and the first part of Henry IV, along with Romeo and Juliet, are all excerpted a combined total of 30 times. What this means is that, even relative to Shakespeare's plays, where every line is spoken. Venus and Adonis enjoyed special prominence as a tool for talking, and more specifically, as a tool for love talking. It makes a certain sense, therefore, that Romeo and Juliet is the most highly exerted of Shakespeare's plays. Like Venus and Adonis, as we've seen, Romeo and Juliet was used as a script for talking love, and like Venus and Adonis, the tragedy is riddled with amorous aphorisms. Take, for instance, Romeo's first entrance onto the stage. "Alas," he exclaims, "that love, whose view is muffled still, should without eyes see pathways to his will. Here's much to do with hate, but more with love. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing, first create." Opposing love to hate, brawling to loving, and nothing to create, Romeo's couplets are a set piece in the balance of antitheses. Each item finds an equal that's also its opposite. They are also completely depersonalized. Even as Romeo vents his impassioned frustration, he avoids mentioning any particular details about his emotional plight. And in fact, this is what provokes his conversation with Benvolio. Romeo's rather oblique in lamenting his erotic frustration, which causes Benvolio to ask him, "What's up?" And so even as Romeo vents his impassioned frustration, he avoids mentioning any particular details about his emotional plight. His language, in other words, is both rigorously sententious and intensely emotional. Romeo's first action on stage is thus to reproduce the style of love talk that Shakespeare himself had helped to popularize with Venus and Adonis. Like Venus, Romeo makes himself into an eloquent font of sententiae. And like Venus, Romeo uses those sententiae for the purposes of expressing his private, erotic emotions. The key difference, however, is that where Venus speaks in a mythical forest, Romeo speaks in the streets of Verona, to his cousin Benvolio, but also to anyone who will listen. Romeo thus appears on stage by doing what so many young men of the period were doing, taking the style of Venus's private complaint and transforming it into a public, conversational aesthetic. Over the course of the tragedy, Romeo will only continue to use this fashionably lovelorn style. "Love goes towards love," he counsels Juliet, as schoolboys from their books, "but love from love towards school with heavy looks." Once again, the bookish style of antithesis and rhyme codified by Venus helps Romeo to make another sententiae in the service of love. His confession to Friar Lawrence offers another example. "I have been feasting with mine enemy," he confesses, "where on a sudden one hath wounded me, that's by me wounded." Wounding and wounded, like Adonis and Venus at once, Romeo is breathless to register the thrill of finding himself caught in another bad romance. Like the language he wields with such skill, Romeo's secret love has the special effect of setting him apart from the rest of Verona, distinguishing him from the public he also loves to address. Shakespeare's tragedy thus offers its audiences another version, a kind of theatrical remix of the love talk that had emerged in the 1590s as a potent source of social distinction. Any playgoer with a few pence to spare could discover more examples of the love talk they prize so highly simply by attending a performance of Romeo and Juliet. Edward Pudsey, for instance, was an avid playgoer from the period who kept his own private commonplace book, a sort of diary in which he wrote down his favorite passages from plays he'd either read or seen. Into this commonplace book, Pudsey was eager to transcribe lines from Shakespeare's tragedy of love for future use, and it was Romeo's overdone declarations of love which most attracted his attention, including Romeo's opening Petrarchan complaint about bright smoke. Unfortunately, this image was the best I could do, and it's quite difficult to make out Pudsey's actual words here. But suffice it to say that language from Romeo and Juliet is being transcribed. These transcriptions were common for the time, and they're echoed by William Drummond, another reader who similarly overscored by hand some of Romeo's most lovelorn declarations, including his aphoristic declaration in the balcony scene that love goes towards love as schoolboys from their books. It's significant that Drummond should light upon this of all passages, the passage that I cited right here. For this passage is included with a few couplets from Venus and Adonis in the Academy of Compliments, a conversation manual that was published in 1640. The title page that I've selected to show you all up here is from 1684, and that is significant in its own right. The Academy of Compliments was an immensely popular conversation manual, and the fact that it was reprinted so many times is a testament to how many people were using it as a guide for their own conversations. And what we have in this manual is a telling excerption from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo's parting words are the only lines that the Academy excerpts from any Shakespearean play, and you can read them just at the top right corner there, under the heading "The Parting of Lovers," which reads, "Love goes to love as schoolboys from their books, but love towards love, school with heavy looks." These parting words, as I said, these are the only lines that the Academy excerpts from any Shakespearean play, and in presenting them as a form of talk for people to actually imitate in their own conversations, the Academy of Compliments plainly lays bare the way Shakespeare's tragedy was itself a manual for talking love. From its very beginnings, the tragedy was conceited in the words of its first title page, rich in conceits for audiences to copy, and it remains so for decades to come. But even as Shakespeare's tragedy invites audiences to use its language in their own affairs, the tragedy also mocks the very citational practices that it invites. Again, Romeo's first scene is instructive. "This love feel I that feel no love in this," Romeo continues, "only for Benvolio to succumb to laughter. Dost thou not laugh?" Romeo asks in earnest bewilderment. It will not be the last time Shakespeare's hero reaches for a tragic grandeur only to fall into a comic bathos. Benvolio's response is telling. He laughs at this misfire of lovesick longing, and though he stifles it, his laughter indirectly invites audiences to laugh along with him. The reason for this, in part, is how overdone Romeo's language is. He piles antithesis upon antithesis and sententiae upon sententiae in order to perform a resplendent melancholy, but it's a melancholy that lacks any legitimating interiority. Instead, Romeo wields a style that has circulated before. He enlists his antitheses in his rhymes in order to communicate an emotional experience of rare profundity, but for us, those figures unfold as the most characteristic features of a style that has already circulated far and wide. It's impossible, in other words, for us to encounter Romeo's style as anything other than a fashionable social posture, or, to put it another way, as a cliché. In this respect, Romeo is Shakespeare's most tragic fashion monger. His language expresses his mastery of a public style that is already in circulation, but he wishes to believe that this language expresses a unique and particularized subjectivity. It is for this reason that he goes on to retreat from Benvolio as the scene unfolds into utter solitude. Alone, Romeo can entertain the illusion that his style has not circulated to him from anywhere, but is instead the emanation of his private most self. Over the course of his tragedy, Shakespeare submits this attitude to a concentrated critique. And nowhere is that critique more convincing or more charismatic than in the character of Mercutio. As the tragedy's most public creature, appearing only in Verona's streets, its alleys, and its walkways, Mercutio is also the tragedy's great critic of fashion. Why? Is not this a lamentable thing, Mercutio muses at one point, that we should be so afflicted with these strange flies, these fashion mongers, these pardon-amies? The character of Tybalt has provoked Mercutio's complaint here, but it is telling that Romeo enters the stage just as Mercutio completes his thought. In a kind of montage effect, Romeo enters the stage as the latest instantiation of those fantasticos and fashion mongers whom Mercutio derides. The power of this stage effect is to distance us from the character we may have wanted to imitate. If Romeo's lines showed playgoers how to follow the fashion for love talk, Mercutio's charismatically agile style of talk offers itself up as an alternative to Romeo's own. When Romeo aspires, for instance, to a familiarly fashionable profundity, he asks, "Is love a tender thing?" But he does not wait for an answer. "It is too rough," he complains, "too rude, too boisterous, and it pricks like thorn." Mercutio's quick response is to upend the language of this lovelorn lamentation. "If love be rough with you," he implores Romeo, "be rough with love. Prick love for pricking, and you beat love down." With this mock command, Mercutio takes the adjectives of Romeo's earnestly stylized complaint and reworks them into a bodied parody of lovesickness. It's a brief moment, but it rehearses in miniature the crucial distinctions that separate Mercutio's style from Romeo's love talk, where Romeo seeks to deploy the most fashionable styles of his moment as if they were the private emanations of his innermost self. Mercutio's habit is to invert, upend, and ironically play upon Romeo's language. The effect of this irony is to get us to laugh at Romeo and his love talk, but it is also to force us to distance ourselves from any desire we may have had to imitate Romeo in our own bids for social distinction. Instead, Shakespeare's tragedy urges us to recognize Mercutio's style as a superior form of social competence. That competence comes from Mercutio's remarkably agile wordplay. It comes, too, from his many references to Venus and to Petrarch, from his many rhymes and his mockery of rhymes, which all demonstrate that Mercutio is someone who can talk the talk as well as anybody. But in ironizing that talk, in praising Venus not as a goddess, but as a gossip, Mercutio distinguishes himself from the fashion he's also shown to master. In so doing, Mercutio exposes, with characteristic wit, Romeo's great error. Like the many gallants who followed in his wake, Romeo misrecognizes love talk as a private style generated from the heart, when in fact it is a public language lifted from poems and from plays. This acerbic lesson is what animates Mercutio's most biting satire of Romeo's lovelorn style. "Romeo, humors, madman, passion, lover," he cries, "appear thou in the likeness of a sigh, speak but one rhyme, and I am satisfied." Like Romeo, Mercutio addresses a character who is, he thinks, absent and cannot, therefore, respond. Also like Romeo, Mercutio delivers this private plea on the public stage of Verona's streets. For both of these men, this public world is the true source of their speech. They pretend to give voice to a private affection, but they do so through language that circulates in public, in bookstalls, in conversations in playhouses, in sonnets and epilia and tragedies. Romeo is at pains to suppress this fact. He wants to believe in a fiction of originality, the fiction that his language comes from the heart rather than the page. Mercutio casually punctures this illusion. By inviting the public to laugh at Mercutio's parodically lovelorn lines, Mercutio obliquely acknowledges the public as the true source of Romeo's language. Through the character of Mercutio, Shakespeare's tragedy thus shows audiences how to beat London's gallants at their own game. By beginning with Romeo's many lovelorn complaints, the play invites us to master one of the most prestigious fashions of the early modern period. But with his wordplay, his irony, and his self-conscious engagements with his audience, Mercutio shows us how to turn that fashion upside down, to riff upon its language rather than to repeat it, and to distinguish ourselves thereby from the fashions that so many young gallants depended upon to present themselves in public. Like Romeo, then, Mercutio has his own secret to share. By following his new style of wordplay and irony, we can put London's fashion mongers out of fashion. Mercutio thus stages public life as a contested and constantly unfolding game of social distinction, and it is for this reason that his death is so tragic. What's lost with Mercutio's life is that ironizing voice, which invites Verona's residents to see social life as a game rather than a war. When we follow Mercutio in acknowledging that game, we are forced to acknowledge that Romeo's love talk is public speech only masquerading as private affection. In other words, we're forced to acknowledge that Romeo's language is a hackneyed cliché. I want to end today by lingering over the prevalence of cliché within Romeo and Juliet. What does it suggest about Shakespeare's great tragedy of love that clichés are so central to it? How are we supposed to think of these clichés, and how should they affect the way we think about the many readers and playgoers who quoted Shakespeare's tragedy in their own conversations? It seems we have a difficult choice to make. On the one hand, the character of Mercutio seems to suggest that the play's language is purely conventional, in which case Shakespeare's many audiences were simply bad readers, incapable of appreciating the tragedy's ironic relationship to the language of love. But to think of Romeo and Juliet in this way is to risk turning it from a depiction of love into a satire of love. But if we argue the opposite, that Shakespeare was not being parodic but sincere, then we're forced to concede that he, like Romeo, was under the spell of his own cliché, blithely beholden to the most mawkish language of love. Neither of these options is particularly appealing, but through the character of Juliet, these conflicting relations to love talk find their theatrical resolution. Famously, Romeo's first encounter with Juliet occurs in just the lovelorn style that Mercutio had urged us to condemn. This is Romeo. "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss." It's not hard to imagine these lines generating a comic misfire of the sort that punctuates Shakespeare's earlier plays. But the tragedy's prologue interestingly conditions us to read this moment as an authentic example of love at first sight. And Juliet encourages Romeo's well-worn compliments by generating some of her own. "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hands too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this." She matches metaphor for metaphor and rhyme for rhyme before summoning her own pointed, amorous aphorism. "For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss." The resulting dialogue is famously a spoken sonnet that ends in the couple's first kiss. It is telling that this scene of successful love talk occurs between two of Mercutio's most cynical parodies of the style. Before the mask is when he tells Romeo to be rough with love, and just after it is when he performs a burlesque of the frustrated lover by wailing at the air, addressing the absent Romeo, and pleading for him to appear in the likeness of a sigh, to speak but one rhyme, and to speak to his gossip Venus one fair word. Bookending the Capulet's ball, these parodies suggest the essential role that the otherwise absent Mercutio plays in understanding Romeo and Juliet's sonnet at first sight. They remind us, forcefully, that the language that Juliet and Romeo use to speak to one another is a language they have taken from public and woven into their own private exchange. Against Mercutio, however, Juliet claims such public origins as a virtue. "You kiss by the book," she remarks with learned pleasure. In another play, it would be possible to read this line as a flirtatious rebuke, the book being a metonym for Shakespeare's slavish dependence on Petrarch, and another sign accordingly of the inauthenticity of his love. Indeed, the school of compliment, Shirley's comedy, enlists the word to just such comic effect. In the school of the play's title, young gallants converge to learn compliments like "vulnerate still your creature, unless to medicine where you have heart." The students are regularly urged to deliver their compliments without the book, in the words of one character. The joke being, of course, that with the book or without it, such compliments are dead on arrival, bearing within them all the traces of bookish acquisition. But as the otherwise voluble Juliet lets her line hang in the air for a moment, it acquires the force of approval, even of wonder. Hardly a source of comedy or scorn, the fidelity with which Romeo follows the book, subscribing to pre-circulated scripts of seduction, becomes the very thing that animates her love. While a long line of critics have read this scene as Shakespeare's attempt to rescue the style of his characters from the deadening grip of cliché, Juliet's praise of the book, delivered between Mercutio's parodies of love talk, suggests Shakespeare's concern with emphasizing, rather than naturalizing, the conventionality of Romeo's courtship. More, it suggests that the cliches Mercutio resists are what motivate Juliet's attraction to Romeo and Romeo's attraction to her. The couple embraces love talk not in spite of its widespread public circulation, but because of it. Taken from a book, Romeo and Juliet's love talk also turns their first private encounter into a version of the love stories that were themselves circulated in books, in sonnets, and in poetic anthologies. The power of these resonances is to turn Romeo and Juliet's conversation from a chance encounter into a familiar romance. The style that is lifted from love stories places its speakers in a love story of their own, furnishing them with a narrative trajectory, a recognizable script that makes their dialogue legible as the first in a series of amorous encounters to come. The cliches of love talk bring the public into the private, and when they kiss by the book, Romeo and Juliet are embracing the public as a condition which endows their love with meaning. I want to end by proposing that Shakespeare's self-conscious embrace of the hackneyed, the mawkish, and the cliché in Romeo and Juliet illuminates a typically early modern conception of love, a conception that both is and is not our own. Or, to put it another way, Shakespeare's play illuminates a conception of love that is our own, even if we don't want it to be. Although we typically think of love as a lyric freedom that blooms outside of the institutions and ideologies of public life, Romeo and Juliet suggests that the experience of love is hardly ever so pure and hardly ever so private. The play stages its well-worn and conspicuously formal style, which so often sounds like language we have heard before, not to repudiate it, but to show the ways love talk is inherited, inhabited, adjusted, and lived. In the styles that precede us, the play demonstrates, we find the linguistic architecture into which we fit our feelings, experiencing language we have taken from elsewhere as the spontaneous expression of our innermost desires. The tragedy claims the language of love as a language that begins in public, in spaces of just the sort where Romeo and Juliet was performed, which is also to say that Romeo and Juliet exposes the dirty secret of love, which is that it's never only our own. Thank you.